Good afternoon, good morning to everybody. We are starting our traditional United for Ukraine webinar. My name is Andrius KUBILIUS. I'm a member of parliament from Lithuania. And today we are going to speak about important geopolitical topic, the way to sustainable peace in Europe, why the West should seek Russia's unconditional defeat in Ukraine. Before going into the topic and giving the floor to our distinguished speakers, just few housekeeping remarks. We shall speak only in English. There is no interpretation, no translation to whatever other languages. Each speaker will have around 10 minutes for his introductory remarks. Then, after we shall conclude introductory remarks, we shall go into discussion and Q&A session. And your questions should be written in a chat in Q&A section, and then we shall try to answer all your questions. So. Why we decided to go and to discuss such really important topic about perspective of sustainable peace and what should be the West goals, the West policies, after all year and a half experience of the war in Ukraine. As I said before to my colleagues, panelists, myself recently, together with colleagues from European Parliament, from Belgium Senate, we visited Kherson and Odessa, and we witnessed really what does it mean war when we came into really the center of missile attack on Odessa port. Then this question of war became, how to say, very close to us, to our borders. The question is really how long the war will continue and what are the possibilities and what are the obstacles to end the war much sooner. And of course, the answer is very simple. Why the war is still continuing and the victory is so difficult to achieve? Because Ukraine does not get enough of weapons from the West. That's my maybe simplified but clear answer. The question is why the West is not moving ahead, and why it so long takes, to convince the West of new weapons to be delivered, either it will be Abrams tanks or ATACMS missiles. I think that the problem is that the West still cannot answer very clearly the question, what is the goal of the West in this war? Usually the West provides very simple answers, which sounds very, very nice, it looks like that this is solidarity peak. The West is saying, well, we shall stay with Ukraine as long as it takes. It's a nice statement, but from my point of view, it's not enough. Because that, in some way, it allows some Westerners to make pressure on Ukraine to diminish their goals in this war, and really, it allows the West to push Ukraine for some kind of ceasefire negotiations with Putin on Putin conditions. I don't know if that is happening, but for me, this formula, as long as it takes, it seems not enough. Because the West is not able to say that the goal of the West should be also unconditional defeat of Russia in Ukraine. I never have seen, such kind of formula announced by anybody, from the leadership of the West, and that is, from my point of view, one of the biggest problems and biggest issues, which really I would be very happy to discuss today. Why the West is not able to say those words? Because I see, several issues what are connected with such unclarity or avoidance to give such a clear position. And the first one is, from my point of view, that the West at least in some corners, still fear of the impact of decisive Ukrainian victory on the future developments in Russia. There is fear of collapse of Putin. What will come after that? Who will take power, instead of Putin? Maybe somebody like Prigozhin will come. Nuclear arms will be not controlled, or will be controlled by guys like Prigozhin. And such fear makes the West very nervous about the perspective and afraid of decisive Ukrainian victory, and unable to commit itself to defeat of Russia and to give enough of weapons to Ukraine. So this is a whole settle. Question is, from where such a fear in the West comes? What are the reasons of such a fear? In my view, there is a lack of belief in the West that Russia can be different, that it can transform itself into normality, to democracy, and that is why the West is so afraid of Putin regime collapse. Of course, it reminds me of the situation of 1990s, when we were, Lithuania, Baltic states, we were advised not to rock the boat of Soviet Union with our demands for independence, because it will destroy Gorbachev. As everybody remembers, we were not listening to those advices, and we have what we have now. So what we can do as a political community in the West, together with Ukrainians, really, we need to convince the West not to be afraid of Kremlin collapse, since this is the only way how transformation in Russia can start. Second, we need to learn from history. I would remind that Roosevelt and Churchill, in January of 1943, in Casablanca conference, closed all the previous discussions on how to end the war and made a declaration that their goal in the war is unconditional surrender of Hitler. And Roosevelt gave very good explanation in a very clear language why only unconditional defeat is needed and is acceptable. And it should be repeated by the same language could be repeated by our Western leaders now. Roosevelt said, because any peace agreement with Hitler will mean that the war will be restarted by Hitler after some time. Second, there is a need of unconditional defeat, not of German nation, but of Nazi ideology, because this is the only way how democracy in Germany can be restored after Hitler. And democracy in Germany is the only way how sustainable peace on the western part of the European continent can be reestablished, because only democracies are not fighting each other. So those were the words. I have no clear quotation, but if you look into the history books, so the words of Roosevelt are described exactly in such a language. So my conclusions here, which I hope we shall go around discussing something similar during our discussion. First, the ways to sustainable peace on the European continent can be established only if Russia is unconditionally defeated. If Putin regime and ideology of Russianism are unconditionally defeated and democracy in Russia is established. It can be achieved only if the West will not be afraid of Ukraine's decisive victory, will declare that the goal of the West and Ukraine in this war is a clear and unconditional defeat of Russia in Ukraine. And third point, the West will be able to declare such a goal in this war if the West will stop to be afraid of Putin regime collapse. Next point, for that, the West needs to abandon the idea that Russian people are not fit for democracy. And the last point, the sustainable peace on the whole European continent can be established only if Russia will become a different country. There is a possibility opening for such a transformation, but will be open only if the West will be able to go for unconditional defeat of Russia in Ukraine. So those are my introductory remarks, which I wanted to share with you, because that is what I am thinking very much about, looking into forthcoming future, into forthcoming autumn and winter season, and of course on the impressions coming back from recently from Ukraine, and now we're turning to our speakers. So first of all, I would like to invite and to give the floor to Ambassador Daniel Fried, who is now, well, we know very well who is Daniel Fried and his role in everything what was happening in this part of Europe during the last 30 years and even more. Now he's Weiser Family Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council from the United States, from Washington, D.C. So Dan, Ambassador Dan, please, floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrius. Appreciate it, appreciate the opportunity. And I'm going to start where you left off. Russia's defeat in Ukraine would be a good thing. The more complete the Russian defeat, the better for us all. So that is a point of agreement. A second point of agreement with your thesis is that we should not be afraid of Russia's defeat. We should not worry about the consequences of Russia losing in Ukraine. We should not hold back because we are afraid of the consequences of the defeat of Putinism. I remember very well those who advised Sąjūdis and you and other Lithuanians to hold back from independence because it would damage Gorbachev. I remember that clearly. I remember having an argument with one of my State Department colleagues on that very question. Learned that the defeat of the Soviet Union was a good thing. Also learned that we learned in the course of Soviet history that change in Russia did not have to be change for the worse. I remember very well 50 years ago when I was a student in Moscow, and the word in the student dormitories was that after Brezhnev, it would be worse. And therefore, students should be happy or at least relatively content with Brezhnev. Well, we know that was not true. After Brezhnev, you had an interregnum, and then you had Gorbachev, who had drawn conclusions from the time of stagnation and tried to reform the system. The point is that the last 40 years of Russian history have been marked by discontinuity, not continuity, and we should not consider Putinism to be inevitable or the apotheosis or the inevitable conclusion of all of Russian history. A third point of agreement I have with you, Andrius, is that Russian democracy is possible. I know many people are skeptical, especially in Ukraine, and God knows they have arguments. But I do not believe that Russia is doomed to live down to the worst elements of its history. Vladimir Kara-Murza is a Russian. He represents the democratic tradition in Russia, which does exist as a kind of minority strain. I agree profoundly with you, Andrius, when you said that Russia has a democratic potential. And I note that the Polish foreign minister, Zbigniew Rau, also expressed that view in his formal expose of Polish foreign policy to the Polish Sejm. So you are not alone in this view. Now, such a view coming, let's be honest, coming from Germany or France might be dismissed by many people. But coming from you, coming from Foreign Minister Rau, this has to be taken seriously. I also think that we should therefore not be afraid of pressing Putin or defeating Putin and Putinism in Ukraine. I do not think that regime change in Russia is our policy or should be our policy. It is, however, a bonus if we get everything else right. Russian history shows that when Russia starts aggressive wars and loses them, the result is often dramatic internal change. The Crimean War led to the reforms of Alexander II. The Russo-Japanese War led to Tsar Nicholas agreeing to a Duma. Well, the defeat in World War I, we know what that led to. Defeat in Afghanistan helped lead to Gorbachev's reforms. You see the pattern. And you probably anticipate my next thought, which is defeat in Ukraine for Russia might lead to reforms. We should not be afraid of it. Neither should we be afraid of escalation on the part of the Russians. We should be cognizant of the danger, but not allow Putin to frighten us by using nuclear threats. We need to have steady nerves. We need to help Ukraine. Now, unconditional surrender. The trouble with I would like to see Russia defeated in Ukraine. The bigger the defeat, the better. But Russia will not be defeated like Germany. We will not occupy Moscow. We will not send troops into Russia. That is not going to happen. And the model for the defeat of Nazi Germany does not apply well to Russia. I would like to see Russia defeated, but it doesn't matter what I would like. Battlefield is still open-ended. We need to help Ukraine as much as we can right now so that it succeeds. I agree with you that the Biden administration has simultaneously done a lot for Ukraine, a lot of weapons. They have, the Biden people have led the international coalition providing weapons to Ukraine. This is serious stuff, and I applaud them for it. At the same time, I cannot explain the long periods of indecision and the inconsistent messaging coming out on the provision of certain advanced weapon systems to Ukraine. And the business with the ATACMS is an illustration. First we say no, then there are leaks that we will say yes, then it looks like we have said yes, but it's not entirely clear. This is bad messaging. And I am critical of the Biden administration because it leads to speculation that indeed we want to help Ukraine, but not enough. I don't think that's quite the case, but I understand the speculation. The Biden administration needs to be clearer in its messaging. We also need to be clear that we do seek and support Ukrainian victory. But it doesn't matter what we say. Ukrainian victory is something which we cannot guarantee. And here, I think, is the administration's dilemma. It is possible for Ukraine to gain the strategic upper hand in this war. That is a reasonable possibility. Ukraine's ground offensive could advance far enough that Ukraine could put Russian supply lines into southern Ukraine, to its forces in southern Ukraine and in Crimea at risk. Doing so would change the strategic calculation of the war. Ukraine, I think, doesn't have to get as far as Melitopol to do this. So Ukrainian military success is possible, and as long as it is reasonably possible, we should do everything in our power to help Ukraine achieve it. But that doesn't mean that total victory will occur. The Biden administration has always said that it is helping Ukraine in order that Ukraine achieve the greatest possible advantage in the eventual negotiations. Now, I do not favor running to Russia with begging for negotiations. To paraphrase something President Obama said, I'm not against all negotiations, I'm just against dumb ones. And it is dumb to chase Russia. John Kerry chased Foreign Minister Lavrov about Syria. His intentions were good, but the results were not. Do not chase Russia. Do not negotiate. Do not offer more and more creative packages to Russia while Putin simply sits with his maximalist position. That is a loser's game. If the Russians want to negotiate, they know how to do it. Our purpose now is not to be creative diplomatically, but to help Ukraine militarily. If the Russians are interested in a negotiated solution, they know how to find us. They know how to find the Ukrainians. Putin has no interest whatsoever at this point. Therefore, I'm not interested in racing to the Russians or coming up with negotiating plans. That is not the point. Eventually, we may have to, and we have to be prepared for that. But that is a different issue, and that decision belongs to Ukraine. Anyway, at the moment, I think our task is clear, which is to help Ukraine as much as possible gain the greatest advantage possible on the battlefield, and to put the most pressure on Russia that we can through weapons provisions and economic pressure. I would like to see Ukraine's total victory. I would like to see Russia driven from every inch of Ukrainian territory. That should be our objective. We have to be prepared for all eventualities, including those we don't want. But I am not in favor of assuming failure when Ukrainian victory is possible. Anyway, I look forward to this discussion. And Andrius, it is great to see you. Thank you for doing this. And since I see Hanna Hopko, I must say, Slava Ukraini.
Geroyam Slava. So Dan, really, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, as always, for your very deep and good and comprehensive analysis of the situation. And now, since you named Hanna Hopko, so really, it's our pleasure and honor to invite Hanna Hopko again. There is no need for long introduction. We know Hanna is a real fighter since whatever times. She's still very young, but fights, you know, for last decades, yeah. And now she's, she was chair of Foreign Affairs Committee in Rada, and now she is chairing ANTS, National Interest Advocacy Network, and many other networks. So, Hanna, pleasure to see you, and the floor is to you.
Thank you, Andrius, and I'm proud to be a part of our United for Ukraine parliamentary network, because I think it's really important that the voices of members of different parliaments are being heard by governments, and especially when we are talking about Ukrainian victory. It's important that the US Congress this April, they registered a resolution on Ukrainian victory, where they state it's bipartisan resolution. And I'm really very grateful to members of US Congress, because in the resolution, they stated that victory means full restoration of Ukraine territorial integrity and sovereignty in 1991 internationally recognized borders. It's also written in the US Congress resolution, Ukraine future membership in NATO, also justice and reparations. And I do believe that European Parliament, which we are very thankful for recognition Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism, which is really important for the future, and confiscation of Russian sovereign assets, private money. And I think it's really important that you have this position. And also, I'm thankful to all our partners and parliaments which recognize that Russia is committing a genocide against Ukraine. Because what's happening in Ukraine, war crimes, crimes against humanity, ecocides, forceful deportation of kids, deliberate attacks on critical energy infrastructure and actually civilian infrastructure, maternity hospitals. So the Russian goal or Russian war goal in Ukraine is obliteration of Ukrainian nation. Nothing changed from last century man-made famine, Holodomor genocide, and this year we will commemorate 90th anniversary of the genocide. And I'm thankful to European Parliament and German Bundestag for recognizing Holodomor as a genocide. But it's pity that this recognition happened only after Russian full-scale war in Ukraine. So I think it's really important to talk about this. And talking about the fear in Western capitals to help Ukraine to win faster. Because as long as it takes, we in Ukraine are very skeptical, because actually there should be no artificial restriction on military and technical assistance to Ukraine. The speed and consistency of weapons delivery remain critical. And honestly, our key needs include sophisticated air defense system, Patriots, NASAMS, IRIS-T, then also long-range missiles like ATACMS, Storm Shadows, Taurus, modern combat aircrafts, especially F-16s. So following the Ambassador Fried message, that of course we are thankful for the weapon we are receiving, but we expected for this year spring counter-offensive to get more at bigger scale, to progress, and not to cease to read some articles in Western newspapers or magazines that they are disappointed that Ukraine, without air defense system, without superiority or even parity in the air, cannot make miracle, cannot be closer to Crimea, which is very unfair. So I think it's really important to say that this incrementalism in sanctions policy, in the weapon supply, is killing Ukraine, is very like destroying not just Ukraine because of constant massive cruise missile, ballistic rockets, kamikaze drones, like Russia is doing every day rocket terror on Ukrainians. And actually, we need more weapons and faster, and especially before winter, because the tactics of Russia is the same. But this is why I think the West finally should understand we in Ukraine will not give up. And actually, if someone expects that Ukraine will be exhausted and run out of soldiers, so I personally will be ready to join to the armed forces instead of traveling to different capitals, and will continue together with the armed forces to defend my country. After the full-scale war, I traveled to 18 countries. My recent visit was to Delhi, to New Delhi in India. And let's be frank, I saw many debates between representatives of Global North and Global South, blaming each other. And it's also one of the reasons of Global South countries when I see this reluctance, especially India, to take more proactive position and to condemn Russian aggression, actually, because after 8 years of peaceful settlement, after 8 years of different attempts to use political diplomatic means to solve Russian aggression, we failed. Let's be frank. Even the ceasefire, long-lasting ceasefire, wasn't achieved during the 8 years of Minsk I, Minsk II, Normandy formats. So, of course, for some countries in Global South, when they are seeing, instead of delivering as a result of peaceful political diplomatic settlement, ceasefire, withdrawal of Russian troops, they are seeing a genocide that Russia committing against us. Also, what we've seen after the Kakhovka, the detonation of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant that Russian occupiers did on June 6th. This is the war crime of ecocide and actually an environmental weapon of mass destruction. But the weak reaction of the international community to this crime will only encourage Russians to commit the next ones. So we here in Ukraine, of course, expect to get more. And we understand that this reluctance or this delay with weapons has reason, this fear. And we have to explain the nature of Russian statehood. And we produce this paper, Endgame Scenarios for Russia's War in Ukraine, which is a really important paper where in Annex 5, we analyze history of Russian wars. And it started from 1817, the year of 1817, the war, Caucasian war, type of war, Russian chauvinism, and then the war you mentioned, Crimean War, Japanese, and it's almost 50 wars that Russians conducted from the beginning of 19th century, 15 with different type of wars. So this is why the defeat of Russia at the territory in Ukraine doesn't mean the end of war. Why it's really it's important to explain, because the liberation of the entire territory of Ukraine and the end of hostilities will not bring an end to the war. And it's not only a matter of reparations for the damage caused to Ukraine and punishing the guilty. Feverish anti-Ukrainian and anti-Western sentiment in tandem with the imperial ambitions of both the Russian elite and also ordinary Russians will sooner or later lead to the future escalations and war. To protect Ukraine and the world for new waves of aggression, and the anti-war coalition needs to create conditions that will result in profound international changes in Russia and to ensure sustainable peace. And compelled by the cause of our defenders, the armed forces of Ukraine, we, the representatives of civil society and expert community, we produced this Sustainable Peace Manifesto. So this is really important because everyone is talking about this peace negotiations, ceasefire deal, or we learned the lessons from Minsk agreement and others. So now it's important to talk about sustainable peace and how to reach the sustainable peace. And in the manifesto, we are also trying to attempt to convey important idea. One cannot achieve peace at the expense of justice, or justice at the expense of peace. For sustainable international security, justice and peace must be achieved simultaneously. Because this, what after all the discussion with different experts, it seems like the strategy is to seek stability, not justice. This is why we see the lack of political will on the issues of tribunal and on the issues of confiscation of Russian assets. So we started a campaign, Make Russia Pay, and we will be traveling with experts and exhibitions to different capitals, including Brussels, Belgium, London, Berlin, because confiscation of Russian assets now will also become a source of money, because when we keep hearing that it's harder and harder for Western taxpayers to support Ukraine, we want to propose this solution. Let's start thinking how legally, using international law, the UN resolutions, to start confiscating Russian assets. I stop here because, and I will send the link explaining the two parts of our Sustainable Peace Manifesto. The contents, they have like responsibility for the war with all punishment, compensation, isolation, and also ensuring sustainable peace. And actually, Ukraine's accession to the European Union and NATO is the #1 prerequisite for sustainable peace. And it's so sad that during the Vilnius Summit, we Ukrainians expected to receive a political formal invitation as a commitment for future membership. But unfortunately, we didn't get it, but we do hope that Washington Summit, NATO Summit, will be more optimistic, and thanks to our Lithuanian friends, Polish friends, and others, we will start another advocacy campaign before Washington DC Summit, because I think it's in the interest of all of us that NATO becomes more global player, having Ukraine as a member in the future with the most powerful, with unique experience, armed forces of Ukraine. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Hanna. And I see really the request from the audience that you should put all the links to all the documents on the chat, or I can advertise you for your website, where perhaps we have your very, very significant and very important documents, links to them, you know, on our website. But it would be good to repeat here. And now I will turn to Roland Freudenstein, let's say Brussels voice or German voice in our discussion. And again, everybody knows Roland very well. Now he's vice president and head of GlobSec Brussels, but we know him for quite many years. And Roland, as always, your bright mind is very much welcome here, you know, to explain us what to do, how to convince the West, also on the European side, you know, to be much more courageous in demanding Russia defeat.
Well, thanks, Andrius, and great to be here with all of you. I would maybe first of all say there's nothing I can disagree with among what has been said, which is of course Andrius' smart selection of speakers, but there are a couple of additions I would like to make. First of all, there is this question of Russia's democratic future or the lack of such a democratic future. And we had some voices, some very skeptical voices in the chat already about this. And I know from many, many conversations with Central European friends who are among the most skeptical people when it comes to Russia's potential to ever become a democracy and therefore ever to become a peaceful nation. Because of course, empire and democracy are mutually exclusive in Russia's case. Now, it's true that, and this is very often said by the very Central Europeans who were completely right about Putin's Russia when it comes to the last 15 years. So, it's not so easy to dismiss their misgivings, and I think we should have a serious conversation about a possible future Russia. And we all know that one of the reasons for the hesitation of Western leaders to deliver the right weapons at the right time to Ukraine is precisely this fear that what comes after Putin is going to be worse than Putin. I mean, Andrei Kolesnikov has just written something interesting for Carnegie Europe a couple of days ago, where he argues pretty convincingly that Russia is neither going to fall apart, nor is what comes after Putin necessarily worse than Putin. And I think these are good arguments. But besides the Central European skepticism about a future Russia which is democratic and cooperative, there are of course also people on the left and on the right politically in the West who are also skeptical about such a positive scenario. And people like John Mearsheimer or so, it doesn't surprise me that they argue in terms of, spheres of influence and, great powers will be great powers, boys will be boys. There's nothing we can do about this. What really amazes me is how parts of the intellectual left have become leftist realists, as they would call themselves. These are leftist intellectuals who sound like Niall Ferguson or Jordan Peterson, God forbid. By saying that Russia will never be a democracy and empires will always be empires. So I think we need, if we want to start arguing that Ukraine has to win this war, Russia has to be defeated, but then there is some perspective for positive change in Russia, precisely because of the defeat. We have a lot of convincing to do. I mean, this is not an automatic consensus in the West right now, nor in Ukraine, by the way, and I totally understand why. I totally respect that. But we just have to be aware that on this question of, is there ever going to be a Russia that will stick together and yet we can cooperate with it because it has completely said goodbye to empire and become a democracy? On that question, the jury is still out and arguments will have to be exchanged. Maybe let me come to a couple of other narratives that have prevented Western countries from giving Ukraine what it needs at the right time. And I would say there is a residual, this is a minority view, but there is a residual view that we can somehow get back to normal, even with Putin. And we should actually strive to get back to normal. That Putin is in some kind of delusion temporarily, but if we make the war costly enough, then he will become a reasonable guy again. He will see that the interest of Russia is not to wage war against its neighbors and so on. This is rarely openly said today, but I think it's in the back of the minds of a couple of leaders, maybe even some in the Chancellor's office in Berlin. These people need to be engaged politically. It's not enough to point fingers at them and say that they're agents of the Kremlin. We have to argue politically that what kind of ideology is behind this war, that this is not about NATO expansion, or it's not about something Ukraine does, it's about something Ukraine is. And that means a sovereign, independent, successful democracy. So what we have to conclude from this is that Putin by now believes that this war is going to be the basis of his power in the future, right? He's starting to need, he's like a junkie who needs the drug. And therefore, precisely, only a defeat will produce an outcome that we can live with. And that means not Russia getting away with Crimea or Donbass or any sizable part of the territory, the Ukrainian territory it has occupied. Because such a, even if he loses most of what he has occupied right now, he will still be able to sell it as a success, and therefore will be thriving. His system, Putinism, will thrive on the narrative that it has paid off to attack Ukraine. And of course, as you all said, then the next attack is only a question of time. Let me just end on this notion that there's also no pan-European security architecture that we can build with either Putin or even even a still imperial Russia after Putin. So as long as Russia is on the imperial track, any kind of pan-European security architecture taking into account Russia's interests is not going to work. But again, there are some people, we have to be aware of this, there are some people in the West who believe that indeed we need to get Russia to have some military losses, but then we can build some kind of consensual security structure. This at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, this was still on the minds of even people like the French president Macron, who kept saying that. To conclude, of course, a successful outcome of this war for everybody means Russia militarily defeated. But as Andrius said in the beginning, to completely exclude a democratic future for Russia is not a constructive policy. But we have to be aware that some of the most reasonable people in the West, namely many Central Europeans, are of a different opinion at the moment. And we need to have this argument very openly. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Roland. Thanks a lot very much. Now, before turning to our last, invited speaker, to Rasuk, I would like to, first of all, to ask speakers to look into chat. Questions are coming, so you should select what you really want to comment by yourself, or then I will ask additionally. But in addition to that, I see that in the audience, we have really very prominent experts on Russia and the whole situation, starting from Alexander Verzbo, Andrei Penkovsky, and Andrius. So my very humble question: if you guys would like to jump in for some comments, from the screen, we're ready to do it. But you should write in the chat that you are ready, because we do not know what are you doing now. So then I'm turning back to Rasa Yuknevichin again. No need to introduce. I can introduce as as a member of European Parliament and a senior politician with whom I was sitting on the same bench for last, 30 years maybe. And of course, former defense minister, former NATO Parliamentary Assembly president, and now vice chair of European People's Party. So she's my boss. So that's my Rasa.
Yeah, thank you very much. We always are arguing who is who and who is more boss. Yes, I always was like vice chair of KUBILIUS in Lithuania in very different capacities. So to the topic, to the point, I will say maybe some words. Many things I also wanted to underline were already mentioned. Of course, the most important battle of this war is going in the eastern front line, no doubts. But the western front is also very important, and they are interlinked as well. So what we are doing here in European Parliament, in other parliaments, governments, Western governments, including, by the way, U4U platform, very successful one. It is important part of Western front line, and we have to elaborate very clear strategy, what we want to achieve in this Western front line. And this topic of the debate, I think, is the most important. I lived through the period when the Soviet totalitarian regime fell as a signatory of the Independence Act of Lithuania, which is my most important event, I would say, in my lifetime. I was a participant of these events, and a lot reminds me from that time. It was already mentioned as well, but today we are witnessing like a second stage of the fall of an empire. There were many supporters of Lithuanian independence during the first fall of empire then. But there also were those who told Lithuanians not to make demands, not to rock the boat. And I will give you a concrete example. Most prominent politicians from that time, Margaret Thatcher, Helmut Kohl, and President Mitterrand, they sent a letter to President Landsbergis 2 months after we declared our independence, saying exactly what I am saying now. We are saying now about please keep more calm process, and they were afraid not to damage Gorbachev, and they were afraid if Soviet Union will collapse. So they were worried about Gorbachev, scared of what would happen, and we were not priority number one. Today, such voices are not very loud, but there is a clear sense of a similar fear. What will happen to Russia if Ukraine achieves a total military victory? Of course, this prevents as well the West from giving everything to Ukraine's victory. Remember, in the very beginning, in February, what messages we got from NATO Secretary General, from all leaders: we cannot provide Ukraine with any weapons because it will be World War III, and so on and so on and so on. Today is not the case to get. I mean, it's Ukraine is getting weapons, not enough, of course, and this is a big mistake that they are getting not enough. The priority at that time was Russia first, And democracy in Russia was not a priority for the West for a long time. And the priority was not to provoke, not to provoke Russia.
Rasa, you something wrong with your connection.
The problem that I am in the hotel here, so it's not everything provided as in my office. So this is why Georgia and Ukraine did not receive an invitation to join NATO in Bucharest. It was the biggest mistake, I think. Neither the 2008 Russian aggression against Georgia nor the 2014 occupation of Crimea changed this thinking. What is most important to say that what we have until now, a colonial empire has persisted on the modern European continent. It has sought to continue its dominance in Eastern Europe, and we allowed this from the West side. Through disinformation and lies, through energy dependence and links with Western politicians, Putin's Russia ensured that the West did not rock the boat. So this war is imperial, and Ukrainians are fighting anti-colonial war. We have to name things what they are. I am a medical doctor in my profession, in my previous profession. So I was educated in my university, first of all, to have the right diagnosis. And only then we will be able to have the right treatment. So the treatment is that we have to not to be afraid to fight against this colonial empire. Unfortunately, many people in Africa or in Latin America, in some Asia countries, don't understand this important content. Maybe we could use all means of soft power for good reasons and tell the truth about the colonial past of Russia. And this will help maybe for in those continents to understand what's going on in reality because they are getting not the right information. Maybe we have to start to use the right titles and right wording. Many media in many countries still call this a name, and we see a lot of titles of the articles, this war-like conflict in Ukraine, or even Ukrainian crisis. I never seen the title, for example, Russia's colonial war against Ukraine, somewhere in CNN or BBC or in other outlets. Not only Ukraine, by the way, Moldova, other countries also are facing, be it hybrid warfare, but this is very dangerous war against, colonial war against those countries. So what does it mean to defeat Putin's regime? To defeat, not to be afraid to defeat Putin's regime means the only right path to sustainable peace in Europe. Hanna talked about that, mentioned several times, sustainable peace. I was born in occupied Lithuania and was born in peacetime, by the way. I didn't see the war, but it was not the peace actually. And do we want such a peace for Ukraine and big part of European continent? Or do we see this momentum, this biggest Putin's mistake to launch this war as a momentum of opportunity to change the landscape in the continent and to go for the completion of the continent on the basis of democracy? I am afraid that many of those who are pushing or will be pushing soon for diplomatic solution via negotiations don't say this openly. What kind of peace do they want to achieve? But such proposals, of course, they lead to temporary provisional peace. And the result will be, as always, the war will come back and will come back very soon. So precondition for sustainable peace of course, is the victory of Ukraine in this war. It is important that the Russian army has been forced out of Ukraine, and the only way to provide Ukraine with all necessary weapons without delay. It is important that Putin should not be able to say at home that he has achieved any victories in this war. The West must not be afraid. I am again repeating this most important, that I see some countries and some politicians are afraid of defeating this regime in this war. Also, it was mentioned, I will not go into the details, Ukraine's membership of the EU and NATO is essential. Without this, it is very difficult to expect any change in Russia. It's not only for Ukraine. We need Ukraine, of course. Not only Ukrainians need us in NATO and EU, but also it's important for the change in Russia. It's like a precondition to change colonial and imperialistic thinking in Russia itself. I think we are heading in the right direction. Putin already lost in the first month of this war. Imagine ourselves in the situation if Ukrainians will not be able to stop Putin next to Kiev. Imagine what situation we would have today. So yes, it is important victory already, but also yes, he is still strong to keep this front line and not to be defeated yet. But look, NATO enlargement, Finland, Sweden, Ukrainian nation was born. South Caucasus is, Russia has less influence in that region, Central Asia. So I saw also in the chat some questions. That one question was how to convince Russians not to support Putin. Remember history. In 1945, when Hitler was defeated, very many Germans still were, or before his lost, very many majority of Germans, they were supporting Hitler. But today's situation is changed. So that's why after Ukraine's victory, after Ukraine will start accession negotiations this year, I believe on that. After invitation of Ukraine to NATO, we have to think about, start to think about Russia and to have strategy on Russia. I see that very many countries, they don't have strategy. Even in my group, the EPP group here in the parliament, we are trying to convince our colleagues not to be afraid to have strategy, not only on China, but also on the future of Russia, and to give up with any thinking that we will be back to business as usual, be it with Putin or be it with somebody else similar like Putin. So we have to be ready to prepare for the reconstruction of Ukraine, to help to rebuild destroyed towns and villages, but we must be prepared and not to be afraid to organize tribunal for Putin and Lukashenko for their war crimes. So also we have not to forget Belarus, Georgia. Today we see what's going on with Armenia and Azerbaijan. Also, we need much more brave steps forward towards those countries. So I also believe that democratic Russia is possible, and I believe it is possible in my lifetime. I believe even more than I believed in some 1985 that I will speak in front of you as member of European Parliament elected in independent Lithuania. At that time, I don't think that very many in Lithuania believe that is possible. So why not now? Maybe those new era, new situation is around the corner. So we have to help Russians as well, but for that we need deputinization, to think about deputinization of this country, denazification of this country, decolonialization, and demilitarization. Maybe not very many, even Democrats in Russia will like what I will say, but I see future Russia without nuclear weapons what they did for some time. And first of all, we have not to be afraid to speak about that and to do this. And Russians, when everything the changes will come with this war, of course, they will start to think. And if this brutal propaganda will stop going, as Germans did, they need some kind of deputinization and desovietization themselves. So maybe my words were too harsh for some Russians. But without that, without evaluation their own history, without evaluation the crimes of their leadership, nobody will be able to help to this country. So the West can help. They just have to say to Ukraine, not as long as it takes, as many politicians are repeating today, but as long as we will help Ukraine to win the victory. This is the best message we have to send to Ukrainians and to the whole world. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Rasa. So really very clear statements from all the speakers. I do not see our additional commentators ready to comment, to make their comments, so we shall go directly to Q&A session. And of course, I see that Dan answered one question which is really perhaps important to understand and to see that very clear logic. I mean, Ukrainian victory, definitely everybody, we understand it's important precondition for everything. For opening possibilities for Russian transformation, or if transformation is not happening, then we need to understand what kind of sustainable peace we can build. And here, definitely, then comes very clearly, membership of Ukraine in EU and NATO as a prerequisite for sustainable peace on the European continent. In such circumstances, membership is needed because of all the different reasons. But that is what we need to understand. But I see again the same question. The West now it's afraid of Ukrainian victory, that it can bring chaos into Russia after Putin will collapse. From another side, the West still is afraid that bringing Ukraine to NATO will provoke, Putin, and so on and so on. So we are in some kind of, how to say, limbo, not moving ahead. So I would like to ask, maybe, I don't know who will start. I see Roland raise his hand. Maybe you can comment also on that, and then Daniel, and then let's look into other questions. So Roland, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I want to take up a couple of points that appeared in the chat. First of all, to what you just said, Andrius, there is one aspect of hesitation to deliver weapons, including ATACMS, by the way, that we haven't discussed yet, and that's the China-Russia trade-off. In other words, the argument by some Trumpists in the United States, even halfway intelligent ones like Elbridge Colby, the argument that we cannot afford, the United States cannot afford to give any more really effective modern weapon systems to Ukraine, simply because that would weaken the US in a future imminent conflict in the Pacific with China. And interestingly, the thinking of Macron, for example, when he says that Europe should not blindly follow the US on China and Taiwan, and the Indo-Pacific is one thing, we should focus on Europe because we shouldn't overcommit ourselves in Asia. Is not, the thinking is not so different. I think both are wrong. I think that security in Europe and security in the Indo-Pacific and the confrontation of democracy and autocracy are exactly the same. are interconnected vessels, it would be called in physics. And the worst thing that could happen to China, which intends to expand in Asia and grab Taiwan, the worst thing that could happen to such a China is a Russian defeat in Ukraine, and a victory by Ukrainian democracy. So, I mean, that is at least something we should also take into account. But now there were two questions that appeared several times in the chat. I think Ksenia and others asked about how about Russian Democrats in exile? How should the West deal with democratic Russians? And the other one about the global South. So Russian Democrats in exile, there are some, again, interesting arguments coming from many Central European and Baltic authors recently, basically saying that, well, they struggle to have a unified vision of Russia. Some of them are still caught up in the imperial mindset. Some of them are agents, and they have no chance of ever playing a decisive role in the future of their country, simply because they're isolated in their own society. Interestingly enough, exactly the same thing was said about dissidents from Central and Eastern Europe in the 1980s. I mean, I remember that because this was my initiation to the whole issue that we're discussing here, was helping Democrats from Poland and other Central European countries organize themselves. And at the same time, of course, people in the West, many people in the West said, look, these guys are probably, some of them are bad apples, and some of them were, yes, so what? These guys have no unified vision. They're constantly bickering among themselves, pointing fingers at each other. And they also have no perspective of ever becoming the prime ministers of their countries. And yet, it was absolutely clear to some of us, including myself, that, hey, we need to help these people because they have the right ideas about the future of their country. And you cannot ask immediately, will this person become a prime minister? You should help them because of the convictions that they have. And look how history developed. Whereas today, if the same arguments are made by Central Europeans about dissidents from Russia and Russian Democrats, I find that a little bit sad, I must say. And I wish some people had slightly longer historical memories. Anyway, for me, it is absolutely clear that no matter whether this or that Russian Democrat is going to become the president in the future, or minister of the economy or energy or whatever, irrespective of that, they have demonstrably said goodbye to the idea of Russian empire. They know that democracy and empire are mutually exclusive in Russia's case, and that alone is a reason to give them all the support that we can. They are still in touch with their societies. They can help us to reach out to ordinary Russians through social media. And I think, therefore, there is an excellent reason to keep talking to these people. And my second point about the global South, I've talked recently to people from Africa, several African countries, including Egypt, for example. I think they somehow are aware that Ukraine is fighting an anti-colonial war, and therefore their attitude is somehow abstractly indefensible, but they will love to point out Western hypocrisy. They love to point out how the US invaded Iraq in 2003, and has anybody apologized for this yet? I think there are lots of answers to be given to that. For one, the comparison of US in Iraq in 2003 and Russia in Ukraine in 2022 and following is actually saying that Zelensky is Saddam Hussein, which is, of course, a humongous insult to reason. But that's only one argument. US also didn't systematically encourage and reward war crimes, and so on and so on. The other argument often made by people from the global south is this: look, morals are morals, but for us, this is a question of survival. I mean, people in an Egyptian supermarket are facing inflation of a degree that we in Europe cannot even imagine. There is an actual loss of prosperity right now going on a broad scale in many southern countries, which drives them to an attitude like, let's stop this ASAP. Okay, we are more concerned about the stability of our countries and our societies on a horizon of a year or two than we are concerned about the long-term effects for aggressors in countries across the world if Russia comes away with territorial gains. This is I'm just quoting what I'm hearing here, and we have to respond to this, that their economic situation will not improve if Russia is successful, and if China feels encouraged thereby to do the next aggression. And in that sense, I think we need to keep taking arguments from the global south seriously, but also self-confidently push against it and really time and time again point out the catastrophic consequences of anything that looks like a success or partial victory for Putin. I'll stop here.
Roland, thanks a lot. And you should look again into the chat, because some greetings you're getting and also new questions. So while you're speaking, new questions are coming. Now, well, I promised the word to Daniel, but I see Andrius came to us. So maybe then you should wait a little bit. We shall ask Andrius to make your comment.
Thank you, Andrius, and thank you very much for this excellent presentation. I, by and large, agree with almost everything, but I would like to make a few comments on the specifics. And it suits me well to come before Dan, because it's primarily about his comments that I wanted to state something. The question is, what is victory? And I think it would be useful if you elaborate about. You said we are not expecting Ukraine to go march on Moscow or something like that, and obviously not. But that is not necessary for victory. We are seeing now many elements of victory already. I think what you and Roland said about regime change in Russia for the last 200 years is true. When you have a terrible dictatorship that has pursued a stupid war, then we see liberalization in Russia almost always. And what we are seeing now among the Russian Democrats in the West, it is that they have consolidated. The silly differences have disappeared. And virtually everybody now recognizes Ukraine's territorial integrity. I think that this is a significant and important development. The Russian Democrats have abandoned imperialism by and large. And what would victory be? It's essentially defeat in Ukraine for Russia. The Ukrainians don't need to go into Russia. And it would even limit it more to Crimea. If Putin loses Crimea, he has lost the war. And that will have domestic impact in Russia. So I think that we, as Generals Ben Hodges and Philip Bridlow, very much focus on Crimea is the key. And I would add there, if a Russian Black Sea fleet is destroyed, that's also a victory. Then just one comment, and that is much of what we and you discussed here, Andrius, it's an extraordinary ignorance in Washington and an extraordinary concentration of the power to the National Security Council, where there are mainly young people who have not served in Russia and who don't know much about Russia. So it's few people who are actually deciding the policy, and the wise people like Dan and Sandy Vershbaum are not no longer in the decising circle of influence. And I should just add here that Russian military expenditure is now probably 10 to 12% of GDP this year. This is a lot. The US military expenditure typically 3.5% of GDP. The Russian military expenditures are not very sustainable. This will cause a lot of negative economic and political effects in Russia. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot. And now, Daniel Fried, please go on with your comments.
Well, Andrius asked about Ukrainian victory. And here is my take for the best realistic scenario. If Ukraine advances on the ground sufficiently, it can put Russian supply lines and Crimea itself at risk. Already we're seeing Ukrainian drone and other attacks on Russian military targets in Crimea and in Russia itself grow from symbolic towards strategic. I don't think they're quite there, but they're getting there. So a combination of Ukrainian ground advance and attacks on Russian military infrastructure and supply lines could lead to a change in the balance. Right now, Putin has no interest in negotiations. The Russians keep repeating their maximum objectives. The Ukrainians can undercut this. At which point, if Putin loses Crimea, he may indeed have lost the war. I mean, this is General Breedlove and Ben Hodges's point, as Anders rightly points out. That begins to set the stage for a Ukrainian strategic victory. Now, I'd love to see Ukraine absolutely rout all the Russian forces out of Ukraine tomorrow. But I'm looking at the most realistic, best case scenario. I don't think this is inevitable. I think it is reasonably possible, and therefore the United States and the West have an obligation to put our thumb on the scale and help Ukraine achieve this realistic objective. I think strategic victory comes when Ukraine is integrated into the West, EU and NATO membership. I think that the conditions for Ukraine are far less favorable than they were for Poland and the Baltic states a generation ago when I was doing this policy. But the EU and NATO are now wrestling with these questions in a way that they have not done in many, many years. And they need to wrestle with these questions because I don't see that long-term European peace will be secured with Ukraine in some sort of a gray zone. So I think that that's the route, that's the way ahead. That is a Ukrainian victory. Let's remember that Putin's objective is to reduce Ukraine to a satellite state of Russia, to basically destroy Ukrainian independence and to some degree destroy Ukrainian nationhood as anything other than a little brother to Russia. Now, I don't know how the war ends, but I'm pretty confident how it will not end. It will not end with the Russian victory parade down the Kreshchatek. That's gone. I mean, that's an important point. The Biden administration thought, and many others thought, that the Russians would win. Now it is clear that they will not conquer all of Ukraine. They will be lucky to retain any part of Ukrainian territory. Moreover, if we are in a position where Ukraine has not pushed the Russians out of Ukraine entirely, it's pretty clear that Ukraine will not, neither Ukraine nor Europe nor the United States will recognize any Russian territorial claims on Ukraine. We're not going to do it. It will be non-recognition and support for Ukraine within its 1991 borders. And any arrangements which include a reality of continued Russian occupation of part of Ukraine are unpleasant, but that doesn't mean that Ukraine is lost. And, I remember perfectly well that West Germany came into NATO when it had a territorial dispute called East Germany. So we have to think of all of these things. And let's also remember that if Ukraine manages to transform itself internally and follow basically the path of Poland and the Baltic states a generation ago, that is also a success, because such a Ukraine will be more prosperous, more free, and it will stand as a rebuke to Putinism. Now, I am guilty, I know, of optimism, but there's no use in sort of reveling in pessimism. It's rough enough as it is. The Ukrainian people are suffering horribly, but there is a reasonable prospect of success. They are not fighting in vain. And one thing about the so-called realists, I believe in realism. I believe in being realistic in any given situation, but I don't believe in elevating realism to a doctrine, because that means, as was established during the Cold War, acceptance of the division of Europe and acceptance that Russia will have a sphere of domination. And I don't accept that. For one thing, I don't like the humanitarian consequences. And another thing, I don't think it's stable. It's not realistic to suppose that people being conquered by Russia will be happy with the conquest. They won't be, and they will revolt against it, so it's not stable. Anyway, that's a longer answer than you wanted, but Andrius, I wanted to dive deep into Andrius's questions.
Good. Thanks a lot, really. Well, time is running, but still we have, a few minutes, and I'm looking to Hannah. And Hannah, you know that in the audience we have quite many participants from Russian opposition in exile. So, and who are asking how they can help, to achieve Ukrainian victory. So maybe you should tell them what you think about their possibilities.
Thank you, Andrius. You know that this is very sensitive question for me, and we have with you different opinion on Russian future and democratization of Russian Federation. But I think that if people living in the territory of Russian Federation will stand up against Russian regime, not just being abroad in exile, but also inside Russia, what Iranian ladies, women did. And this will be really very inspiring. Of course, they could also support our Sustainable Peace Manifesto demands, which also includes decolonization of Russian history and information policy. Also, when we are talking about the process of de-Russiization and also confiscation of Russian assets. As I mentioned, we launched the campaign Make Russia Pay, and I do believe that people will, Russian opposition will join this campaign also, demanding the confiscation of Russian sovereign assets, because this is the way to reach sustainable peace and not just a strategic break for someone to prepare for another escalation. And also, honestly, it's like a deja vu. In 1991, during the Soviet Union collapse, there were also Western leaders insisting on Ukraine to keep staying in the Soviet Union, being afraid of Ukraine nuclear, the third largest nuclear arsenal, and many other things. But the independence of Ukraine, or when we renewed our statehood and independence, also became the guarantee that now, during the almost 10 years of Russian ongoing aggression, we are the real shield protecting Europe and our neighbors. So I think the end of Soviet Union wasn't the end of Russian imperialism. It became just the end of Russian of Soviet Union or communist ideology. But Russian imperialism, and we are all focusing on just Putin, Putin, Putin. But I mentioned all Russians war, or from Moscow, Soviet Union, and now Russian Federation. And it's really important to understand that for me, strategic victory is not just restoration, full restoration of all our territories, including Crimea. Strategic victory when I can visit Moscow, the Red Square of Moscow, and to see the monuments, the memorials to the victims of Holodomor, to the victims of Chechens war, Russian war against Chechen genocide, and also what Russians did in Syria and what Russians are doing now. So Russian society, instead of a Stalin monument in the Red Square, they have to see the monuments to the victims of Russian imperialism. And this is the part also of Russian consciousness when they will be changing. And of course, why when we are talking about everyone is being afraid of Russian military defeat in Ukraine, because it might trigger the chaos or even start different processes of Russian end of imperialism. So, but I think that it's really important, knowing the history, to explain our Western friends that this delay costed lives for us. But for the future strategy, we need finally to start thinking, and it's also written in our Sustainable Peace Manifesto, that Russia must suffer a loss of status. It should not be allowed to influence international politics through international organization. An aggressor cannot be a member of the UN Security Council. Those core mission is to guarantee peace, and many others. So we are talking about the whole international system, not just about, as Roland mentioned, the new pan-European security architecture, either still with Putin. No, Putin should be under international legislation and should be in Hague in the tribunal. So this is clear for us. And not just Putin, and also Lavrov, Shoigu, and all these criminals. But I think the problem of the West, there are many experts thinking that they do understand Russia, but actually the success of the West would have been happened if we prevent the genocide which Russia is committing against now. So this is the key message. Unfortunately, the failure of Western approach through political diplomatic way to negotiate a ceasefire failed, and no one in the West has this, how to say, bravery to recognize this failure, and now to correct these mistakes by providing Ukraine everything we need to win and to defeat the enemy. And all these 1.5 back channels or track diplomacy and all these attempts, which makes me worry that now there are many, there are more attempts to talk with Russia behind Ukraine. So nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. So I think it's really important that we deserve sustainable peace altogether, that never again genocides are coming to the European continent. And my last point, because we have to start the process in the European Parliament or in the European nations, what the kids of the European countries are learning. How do they consider the Russian aggression against Ukraine? As a war against Europe, as imperial, colonial, genocidal war, or only as a war which happens somewhere in eastern flank of NATO, in country which is not now a member of NATO or nor NATO nor either EU? Because the kids like my daughter currently 12 years old and others, I do believe they will not fight another war with Russia, but they will be working together with European kids in the EU and NATO, and they will be on the same page, understanding what Russian aggression against Ukraine was, that this was against European values, it was against European civilization, and it's not just about Russian war against Ukraine. So what they are studying in the schools now, it's important because look at the Slovak parliamentary elections in Slovak Republic. How many pro-Russian supporters or Russian narrative supporters. So I think it's really important to be on the same page of recognition Russian aggression against Ukraine as a Russian war against Europe, imperial, colonial, with genocidal character. And this is, we have to start working on this now. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot. Our time is running. I hope that, still we have a few minutes. So now final comments from Rasa, and then I will try to conclude.
Yeah. I was disconnected a little bit because I had very important another conversation, but as I know, it was somebody, Hannah, also mentioned that she doesn't believe in Russia's future. Yes, of course, I don't know as well, and my remarks will be on Russia a little bit, because there are some questions as well. Nobody knows what will happen, and I am not as optimistic as maybe you can imagine, but otherwise, without at least trying, without at least thinking about more strategically about the future, is Ukrainian interest in the future, like ours interest to have different Russia, at least to try to do this, to help this. Because otherwise you and we in Europe, we will have again and again the same attempts to launch the wars. Maybe it will happen, I don't know. But on the other hand, if Ukraine wins, and when Ukraine will win this war, and Russia will lose its periphery as they treat now, like Moldova, other countries, in some years, and if democratic forces would be able at least to try to build again democracy, then Russian occupation from inside will be over. Because today Russia is like occupied a nation, Russians and other nations, they are like, including Russians, they are like occupied by Putinization and this post-Soviet past nation. And we have to help them to liberate themselves. Without that, those millions and millions people in the East, in Eurasian continent, as they say, they will lead us to the new wars. And of course, countries like China also, they have no interest at all to have democratic Russia in these continents. So that's why I think we need maybe a separate panel on the future of Russia to speak about that. Not it's very easy to say that I don't believe. It's very easy. Most complicated way is to try, just to try.
Okay, thanks a lot, Rasa. And yeah, just maybe for some thoughts for conclusion from my side. First of all, really appreciate very much, all your participation and the audience, where we have quite many also our friends from Russian opposition. So this is very important. Also, I think that all of us, we need to discuss also the future of Russia, like it was done during Second World War. Churchill and of course circumstances were different, but if you look back, it's very clear that Churchill and Roosevelt were discussing the future of Germany after the war. There were some misleading plans like Morgenthau, but then decisions were proper decisions were made. So on some comments and some my reactions. I think that we need to understand Ukraine. Really, there is no other way for us in the West to understand that the only way is Ukraine victory. Now, whatever different, scenarios that maybe, peace can be negotiated with Putin, without taking by Ukrainians all the control of the territory. I don't see that this is realistic. Ukrainians will not agree. So how, things can develop, maybe, Putin will declare that he wants a war and he will retract from Ukraine, whatever, he can declare what he wants. But without bringing back the control of the whole Ukraine, to Ukrainian nation, I do not see any possibility of any kind of peace. So then it's a question to us, if we see in the same way, so we need to deliver weapons. And that's, the only solution. And as quickly as we shall understand such a situation, that peace will be coming sooner. So that's my point. Second, of course, I still see this hesitation in the Western capitals that, well, if Ukraine is defeating Russia in Ukraine itself, I'm not talking, Russia in Moscow or whatever, but if Russia is, pushed out from Ukraine, then maybe Putin regime will collapse and that will be a big danger. So let's look how we can get rid of that, of that very wrong, fears. Second, of course, forever, reason, but absolutely, it's clear. Our next, geopolitical goal: Ukraine should become EU and NATO member, tomorrow. It would be good, especially NATO, to invite Ukraine to NATO, because that would be a signal, very clear signal to Russian people and Russian elite that forget about, Ukraine. Ukraine is gone. It's Brzezinski formula. Russia without ability to control, Ukraine, has the possibility to become a democracy. So let's start to help Russia in such a way, inviting Ukraine to become NATO. And that is why, in my view, still what is missing. We need to have a strategy, really, how we can help Russia to transform itself, how we shall use this opportunity. Maybe, as Russia have said, maybe we shall be not successful, but let's have a strategy. So that's what we're trying to do with Brussels Dialogue, initiative, talking with Russian, opposition, and trying to push EU institutions, to have a strategy where Ukraine will play most important role in Russian transformation. Both Ukrainian victory and Ukrainian success through its membership in EU and NATO, that is an inspiration for Russia to follow. So, again, I am a believer that Russia also can become a democracy. I know that we are still, in minority, but I hope that we shall manage to convince also others, to baptize others into such a belief. But in any case, we need to use this opportunity. That's my feeling. And at the end, we need to see very clearly, with clear eyes, how we can bring sustainable peace on the European continent. And we can have only two options, to make final, comment. Sustainable peace on the whole European continent with democratic Russia, or sustainable peace against authoritarian Russia with, Ukraine and other Eastern Partnership countries, on the Western side, with membership in EU and NATO. Everything else in between will not work, as an instrument or as a basis for sustainable peace. So that's what we need to have in mind, and that is for what we need to continue our political battles in the Western Front, like Russia said, and that's what we were trying to do today. So thanks a lot again to all of you. And we shall continue now, and we shall invite you to other meetings of our network of United for Ukraine. And also, again, I would like also to welcome presence of Russian opposition experts, because this is our common task. I mean, sustainable peace on the European continent is needed not only for Ukraine, it's needed not only for Russian, liberal opposition. It's very much needed also for us, and not only for Lithuanians, but I hope also for Germans and maybe for Americans.
And
so,
Andrius,
yeah.
I think we still have around 78 participants. They need to hear our gratitude to you personally and members of European Parliament who are traveling not just to Kyiv, and also to Kherson, Mykolaiv, Odessa city. So I encourage all our strategic partners not to be afraid to come to Ukraine, especially visiting to southern eastern part of Ukraine. And this is, I think, another important way to support Ukraine by physical presence and demonstrating Russia that we are not afraid of their massive rockets, and sending a clear signals to Western governments that we need more anti-air defense system. So thank you for your bravery and your recent visit to Ukraine, Mykolaiv, Odessa, Kherson, and because people, and especially local communities there, they are very, very thankful that you are high-level representatives from European Parliament coming to them. So, and this is another way of solidarity and support.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Hannah. As I said at the very beginning, I understood how much you need, missile defense of the highest quality. So that was experiencing, to have such an understanding. So thanks a lot to everybody, and good luck, and Slava Ukraine.
Heroям Slava. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.